Welcome back. This is Storyman. I hope you've been enjoying our stories. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them below. I'll be very happy to hear from you. This time, our story will be from the 1001 Nights, otherwise known as the Arabian Nights, a collection of tales from the Middle East that is hundreds of years old. Some of the stories are very well known, but I didn't know about this story until I ran into it in a collection of 1001 Nights stories. It's a little long, so I've divided it up into 3 sections, and this story divides nicely, because it really becomes 3 stories in one, as many of the 1001 Nights stories do. In the main narrative, this was an attempt to keep the listener, the king, engaged, so he would want to hear more the next night. But we'll talk more about that meta-story in another Storyman episode. For now, please enjoy with me The Talking Bird, The Singing Tree, and The Golden Water. The Talking Bird, The Singing Tree, and the Golden Water. One of the Arabian Nights. There was an emperor of Persia named Khosrow, who, when he first came to his crown in order to obtain a knowledge of affairs, took great pleasure in night excursions, attended by a trusty minister. He often walked in disguise through the city, and met with many adventures, one of the most remarkable of which happened to him upon his first ramble, which was not long after his accession to the throne of his father. After the ceremonies of his father's funeral rites and his own inauguration were over, the new sultan, as well from inclination as from duty, went out one evening attended by his grand vizier, disguised like himself, to observe what was transacting in the city. As he was passing through a street in that part of the town inhabited only by the meaner sort, he heard some people talking very loud, and going close to the house whence the noise proceeded, and looking through a crack in the door, perceived a light, and there 3 sisters sitting on a sofa conversing together after supper. By what the eldest said, he presently understood the subject of their conversation was wishes. "For," said she, "since we are talking about wishes, mine shall be to have the sultan's baker for my husband, for then I shall eat my fill of that bread, which, by way of excellence, is called the sultan's. Let us see if your tastes are as good as mine." "For my part," replied the second sister, "I wish I was wife to the sultan's cook, for then I should eat of the most excellent dishes. And as I am persuaded that the sultan's bread is common in the palace, I should not want any of that. Therefore you see," addressing herself to her eldest sister, "that I have a better taste than you." The youngest sister, who was very beautiful and had more charms and wit than the 2 elder, spoke in her turn. "For my part, sisters," said she, "I shall not limit my desires to such trifles, but take a higher flight. And since we are upon wishing, I wish to be the emperor's queen consort. I would make him father of a prince whose hair should be gold on one side of his head and silver on the other. When he cried, the tears from his eyes should be pearls, and when he smiled, his vermilion lips should look like a rosebud fresh blown." The 3 sisters' wishes, particularly that of the youngest, seemed so singular to the sultan that he resolved to gratify them in their desires. But without communicating his design to his grand vizier, he charged him only to take notice of the house and bring the 3 sisters before him the following day. The grand vizier, in executing the emperor's orders, would but just give the sisters time to dress themselves to appear before his majesty without telling them the reason. He brought them to the palace and presented them to the emperor, who said to them, "Do you remember the wishes you expressed last night when you were all in so pleasant a mood?" Speak the truth. I must know what they were." At these unexpected words of the emperor, the three sisters were much confounded. They cast down their eyes and blushed, and the color which rose in the cheeks of the youngest quite captivated the emperor's heart. Modesty, and fear lest they might have offended by their conversation, kept them silent. The emperor, perceiving their confusion, said to encourage them, "Fear nothing. I did not send for you to distress you. And since I see that without my intending it this is the effect of the question I asked, as I know the wish of each, I will relieve you from your fears. You," added he, "who wish to be my wife, shall have your desire this day. And you," continued he, addressing himself to the two elder sisters, "shall also be married to my chief baker and cook." As soon as the Sultan had declared his pleasure, the youngest sister, setting her elders an example, threw herself at the emperor's feet to express her gratitude. "Sir," said she, "my wish, since it has come to your Majesty's knowledge, was expressed only in the way of conversation and amusement. I am unworthy of the honor you do me, and supplicate your pardon for my presumption." The other two sisters would have excused themselves also, but the emperor, interrupting them, said, "No, no. It shall be as I have declared. The wishes of all shall be fulfilled." The nuptials were all celebrated that day, as the emperor had resolved, but in a different manner. The youngest sisters was solemnized with all the rejoicings usual at the marriages of the emperors of Persia, and those of the other two sisters according to the quality and distinction of their husbands, the one as the sultan's chief baker, the other as head cook. The two elder felt strongly the disproportion of their marriages to that of their younger sister. This consideration made them far from being content, though they were arrived at the utmost height of their late wishes, and much beyond their hopes. They gave themselves up to an excess of jealousy, which not only disturbed their joy, but was the cause of great trouble and affliction to the queen consort, their younger sister. They had not an opportunity to communicate their thoughts to each other on the preference the emperor had given her, but were altogether employed in preparing themselves for the celebration of their marriages. Some days afterward, when they had an opportunity of seeing each other at the public baths, the elder said to the other, "Well, what say you to our sister's great fortune? Is not she a fine person to be a queen?" "I must own," said the other sister, "I cannot conceive what charms the emperor could discover to be so bewitched by her. Was it a reason sufficient for him not to cast his eyes on you because she was somewhat younger? You were as worthy of his throne, and in justice he ought to have preferred you." "Sister," said the elder, "I should not have regretted if his Majesty had but pitched upon you, but that he should choose that little simpleton really grieves me. But I will revenge myself. And you, I think, are as much concerned as I. Therefore I propose that we should contrive measures and act in concert. Communicate to me what you think the likeliest way to mortify her, while I on my side will inform you what my desire of revenge shall suggest to me." After this wicked agreement, the two sisters saw each other frequently and consulted how they might disturb and interrupt the happiness of the queen. They proposed a great many ways, but in deliberating about the manner of executing them found so many difficulties that they durst not attempt them. In the meantime, with a detestable dissimulation, they often went together to make her visits, and every time showed her all the marks of affection they could devise to persuade her how overjoyed they were to have a sister raised to so high a fortune. The queen, on her part, constantly received them with all the demonstrations of esteem they could expect from so near a relative. Some time after her marriage, the expected birth of an heir gave great joy to the queen and emperor, which was communicated to all the court, and spread throughout the empire. Upon this news the two sisters came to pay their compliments and proffered their services, desiring her, if not provided with nurses, to accept of them. The queen said to them most obligingly, "Sisters, I should desire nothing more if it were in my power to make the choice. I am, however, obliged to you for your good will, but must submit to what the emperor shall order on this occasion. Let your husbands employ their friends to make interest, and get some courtier to ask this favor of his majesty. And if he speaks to me about it, be assured that I shall not only express the pleasure he does me, but thank him for making choice of you." The two husbands applied themselves to some courtiers, their patrons, and begged of them to use their interest to procure their wives the honor they aspired to. Those patrons exerted themselves so much in their behalf that the emperor promised them to consider of the matter, and was as good as his word, for in conversation with the queen he told her that he thought her sisters were the most proper persons to be about her, but would not name them before he had asked her consent. The queen, sensible of the deference the emperor so obligingly paid her, said to him, "Sir, I was prepared to do as your majesty might please to command, but since you have been so kind as to think of my sisters, I thank you for the regard you have shown them for my sake, and therefore I shall not dissemble that I had rather have them than strangers." The emperor therefore named the queen's two sisters to be her attendants, and from that time they went frequently to the palace, overjoyed at the opportunity they would have of executing the detestable wickedness they had meditated against the queen. Shortly afterward, a young prince as bright as the day was born to the queen. But neither his innocence nor beauty could move the cruel hearts of the merciless sisters. They wrapped him up carelessly in his cloths and put him into a basket, which they abandoned to the stream of a small canal that ran under the queen's apartment, and declared that she had given birth to a puppy. This dreadful intelligence was announced to the emperor, who became so angry at the circumstance that he was likely to have occasioned the queen's death if his grand vizier had not represented to him that he could not, without injustice, make her answerable for the misfortune. In the meantime, the basket in which the little prince was exposed was carried by the stream beyond a wall which bounded the prospect of the queen's apartment, and from thence floated with the current down the gardens. By chance, the intendant of the emperor's gardens, one of the principal officers of the kingdom, was walking in the garden by the side of this canal, and perceiving a basket floating, called to a gardener who was not far off to bring it to shore, that he might see what it contained. The gardener, with a rake which he had in his hand, drew the basket to the side of the canal, took it up, and gave it to him. The intendant of the gardens was extremely surprised to see in the basket a child, which, though he knew it could be but just born, had very fine features. This officer had been married several years, but though he had always been desirous of having children, heaven had never blessed him with any. This accident interrupted his walk. He made the gardener follow him with the child, and when he came to his own house, which was situated at the entrance to the gardens of the palace, went into his wife's apartment. "Wife," said he, "as we have no children of our own, God has sent us one. I recommend him to you. Provide him a nurse, and take as much care of him as if he were our own son, for from this moment I acknowledge him as such." The intendant's wife received the child with great joy, and took particular pleasure in the care of him. The intendant himself would not inquire too narrowly whence the infant came. He saw plainly it came not far off from the queen's apartment. But it was not his business to examine too closely into what had passed, nor to create disturbances in a place where peace was so necessary. The following year, another prince was born, on whom the unnatural sisters had no more compassion than on his brother, but exposed him likewise in a basket, and set him adrift in the canal, pretending this time that the sultana had given birth to a cat. It was happy also for this child that the intendant of the gardens was walking by the canal side, for he had it carried to his wife, and charged her to take as much care of it as of the former, which was as agreeable to her inclination as it was to his own. The Emperor of Persia was more enraged this time against the queen than before, and she had felt the effects of his anger, if the Grand Vizier's remonstrances had not prevailed. The third year, the queen gave birth to a princess, which innocent babe underwent the same fate as her brothers. For the two sisters, being determined not to desist from their detestable schemes till they had seen the queen cast off and humbled, claimed that a log of wood had been born, and exposed this infant also on the canal. But the princess, as well as her brothers, was preserved from death by the compassion and charity of the intendant of the gardens. Khosrow Shah could no longer contain himself when he was informed of the new misfortune. He pronounced sentence of death upon the wretched queen, and ordered the Grand Vizier to see it executed. The Grand Vizier and the courtiers who were present cast themselves at the emperor's feet to beg of him to revoke the sentence. "Your Majesty, I hope, will give me leave," said the Grand Vizier, "to represent to you that the laws which condemn persons to death were made to punish crimes. The three extraordinary misfortunes of the queen are not crimes, for in what can she be said to have contributed toward them? Your Majesty may abstain from seeing her, but let her live. The affliction in which she will spend the rest of her life, after the loss of your favor, will be a punishment sufficiently distressing." The Emperor of Persia considered with himself, and reflecting that it was unjust to condemn the queen to death for what had happened, said, "Let her live, then. I will spare her life, but it shall be on this condition, that she shall desire to die more than once every day. Let a wooden shed be built for her at the gate of the principal mosque, with iron bars to the windows, and let her be put into it in the coarsest habit. And every Mussulman that shall go into the mosque to prayers shall heap scorn upon her. If anyone fail, I will have him exposed to the same punishment. And that I may be punctually obeyed, I charge you, Vizier, to appoint persons to see this done." The emperor pronounced his sentence in such a tone that the Grand Vizier durst not further remonstrate, and it was executed, to the great satisfaction of the two envious sisters. A shed was built, and the queen, truly worthy of compassion, was put into it and exposed ignominiously to the contempt of the people, which usage she bore with a patient resignation that excited the compassion of those who were discriminating and judged of things better than the vulgar. The two princes and the princess were, in the meantime, nursed and brought up by the intendant of the gardens and his wife with the tenderness of a father and mother. And as they advanced in age, they all showed marks of superior dignity, which discovered itself every day by a certain air which could only belong to exalted birth. All this increased the affections of the intendant and his wife, who called the eldest prince Bahman, and the second Perviz, both of them names of the most ancient emperors of Persia, and the princess Periazad, which name had also been borne by several queens and princesses of the kingdom. As soon as the two princes were old enough, the intendant provided proper masters to teach them to read and write, and the princess, their sister, who was often with them, showing a great desire to learn, The intendant, pleased with her quickness, employed the same master to teach her also. Her vivacity and piercing wit made her, in a little time, as great a proficient as her brothers. From that time, the brothers and sister had the same masters in geography, poetry, history, and even the secret sciences, and made so wonderful a progress that their tutors were amazed and frankly owned that they could teach them nothing more. At the hours of recreation, the princess learned to sing and play upon all sorts of instruments, and when the princes were learning to ride, she would not permit them to have that advantage over her, but went to all the exercises with them, learning to ride also, to bend the bow, and dart the reed or javelin, and oftentimes outdid them in the race and other contests of agility. The intendant of the gardens was so overjoyed to find his adopted children so accomplished in all the perfections of body and mind, and that they so well requited the expense he had been at in their education, that he resolved to be at a still greater. For as he had until then been content simply with his lodge at the entrance of the garden, and kept no country house, he purchased a mansion at a short distance from the city, surrounded by a large tract of arable land, meadows, and woods. As the house was not sufficiently handsome nor convenient, he pulled it down and spared no expense in building a more magnificent residence. He went every day to hasten by his presence the great number of workmen he employed, and as soon as there was an apartment ready to receive him, passed several days together there, when his presence was not necessary at court, and by the same exertions the interior was furnished in the richest manner, in consonance with the magnificence of the edifice. Afterward he made gardens, according to a plan drawn by himself. He took in a large extent of ground, which he walled around, and stocked with fallow deer, that the princes and princess might divert themselves with hunting when they chose. When this country seat was finished and fit for habitation, the intendant of the gardens went and cast himself at the emperor's feet, and after representing how long he had served and the infirmities of age which he found growing upon him, begged that he might be permitted to resign his charge into his majesty's disposal and retire. The emperor gave him leave, with the more pleasure because he was satisfied with his long services, both in his father's reign and his own, and when he granted it, asked what he should do to recompense him. "Sir," replied the intendant of the gardens, "I have received so many obligations from your majesty and the late emperor your father, of happy memory, that I desire no more than the honor of dying in your favor." He took his leave of the emperor, and retired with the two princes and the princess to the country retreat he had built. His wife had been dead some years, and he himself had not lived above 6 months with his charges before he was surprised by so sudden a death that he had not time to give them the least account of the manner in which he had discovered them. The princes Bahman and Perviz and the princess Periazad, who knew no other father than the intendant of the emperor's gardens, regretted and bewailed him as such, and paid all the honors in his funeral obsequies, which love and filial gratitude required of them. Satisfied with the plentiful fortune he had left them, they lived together in perfect union, free from the ambition of distinguishing themselves at court, or aspiring to places of honor and dignity, which they might easily have obtained. One day, when the two princes were hunting and the princess had remained at home, a religious old woman came to the gate and desired leave to go in, to say her prayers, it being the hour. The servants asked the princess's permission, who ordered them to show her into the oratory, which the intendant of the emperor's gardens had taken care to fit up in his house, for want of a mosque in the neighborhood. She bade them also, after the good woman had finished her prayers, to show her the house and gardens, and then bring her to the hall. The old woman went into the oratory, said her prayers, and when she came out, 2 of the princess's women invited her to see the residence, which civility she accepted, followed them from one apartment to another, and observed like a person who understood what belonged to furniture the nice arrangement of everything. They conducted her also into the garden, the disposition of which she found so well planned that she admired it, observing that the person who had formed it must have been an excellent master of his art. Afterward, she was brought before the princess, who waited for her in the great hall, which in beauty and richness exceeded all that she had admired in the other apartments. As soon as the princess saw the devout woman, she said to her, "My good mother, come near and sit down by me. I am overjoyed at the happiness of having the opportunity of profiting for some moments by the example and conversation of such a person as you, who have taken the right way by dedicating yourself to the service of God. I wish everyone were as wise." The devout woman, instead of sitting on a sofa, would only sit upon the edge of one. The princess would not permit her to do so, but rising from her seat and taking her by the hand, obliged her to come and sit by her. The good woman, sensible of the civility, said, "Madam, I ought not to have so much respect shown me, but since you command and are mistress of your own house, I will obey you." When she had seated herself, before they entered into any conversation, one of the princess's women brought a low stand of mother-of-pearl and ebony, with a china dish full of cakes upon it, and many others set round it, full of fruits in season, and wet and dry sweetmeats. The princess took up one of the cakes, and presenting her with it, said, "Eat, good mother, and make choice of what you like best. You had need to eat after coming so far." "Madam," replied the good woman, "I am not used to eat such delicacies, but will not refuse what God has sent me by so liberal a hand as yours." While the devout woman was eating, the princess ate a little too to bear her company, and asked her many questions upon the exercise of devotion which she practiced and how she lived, all of which she answered with great modesty. Talking of various things, at last the princess asked her what she thought of the house and how she liked it. "Madam," answered the devout woman, "I must certainly have very bad taste to disapprove anything in it, since it is beautiful, regular, and magnificently furnished with exactness and judgment, and all its ornaments adjusted in the best manner. Its situation is in an agreeable spot, and no garden can be more delightful. But yet, if you will give me leave to speak my mind freely, I will take the liberty to tell you that this house would be incomparable if it had 3 things which are wanting to complete it." "My good mother," replied the Princess Parizade, "what are those? I entreat you to tell me what they are. I will spare nothing to get them." "Madam," replied the devout woman, "the first of these 3 things is the talking bird, so singular a creature that it draws round it all the songsters of the neighborhood which come to accompany its voice. The second is the singing tree, the leaves of which are so many mouths which form an harmonious concert of different voices and never cease. The third is the golden water, a single drop of which being poured into a vessel properly prepared, it increases so as to fill it immediately, and rises up in the middle like a fountain which continually plays, and yet the basin never overflows." "Ah, my good mother," cried the princess, "how much I am obliged to you for the knowledge of these curiosities! I never before heard there were such rarities in the world. But as I am persuaded that you know, I expect that you should do me the favor to inform me where they are to be found." "Madam," replied the good woman, "I should be unworthy the hospitality you have shown me if I should refuse to satisfy your curiosity on that point, and I am glad to have the honor to tell you that these curiosities are all to be met with in the same spot, on the confines of this kingdom, toward India. The road lies before your house, and whoever you send needs but follow it for 20 days. And on the 20th only let him ask the first person he meets where the talking bird, the singing tree, and the golden water are, and he will be informed." After saying this, she rose from her seat, took her leave, and went her way. The Princess Parizad's thoughts were so taken up with the talking bird, singing tree, and golden water that she never perceived the devout woman's departure, till she wanted to ask her some question for her better information, for she thought that what she had been told was not a sufficient reason for exposing herself by undertaking a long journey. However, she would not send after her visitor, but endeavored to remember all the directions, and when she thought she had recollected every word, took real pleasure in thinking of the satisfaction she should have if she could get these curiosities into her possession. But the difficulties she apprehended and the fear of not succeeding made her very uneasy. She was absorbed in these thoughts when her brothers returned from hunting, who, when they entered the great hall, instead of finding her lively and gay as she was wont to be, were amazed to see her so pensive and hanging down her head as if something troubled her. "Sister," said Prince Bahman, "what is become of all your mirth and gaiety? Are you not well? Or has some misfortune befallen you? Tell us, that we may know how to act and give you some relief. If anyone has affronted you, we will resent his insolence." The princess remained in the same posture some time without answering, but at last lifted up her eyes to look at her brothers, and then held them down again, telling them nothing disturbed her. "Sister," said Prince Bahman, "you conceal the truth from us. There must be something of consequence. It is impossible that we could observe so sudden a change if nothing was the matter with you. You would not have us satisfied with the evasive answer you have given. Do not conceal anything, unless you would have us suspect that you renounce the strict union which has hitherto subsisted between us." The princess, who had not the smallest intention to offend her brothers, would not suffer them to entertain such a thought, but said, "When I told you nothing disturbed me, I meant nothing that was of importance to you. But to me it is of some consequence. And since you press me to tell you by our strict union and friendship, which are so dear to me, I will. You think, and I always believed so too, that this house was so complete that nothing was wanting. But this day I have learned that it lacks 3 rarities, which would render it so perfect that no country seat in the world could be compared with it. These 3 things are the talking bird, the singing tree, and the golden water." After she had informed them wherein consisted the excellency of these rarities, "A devout woman," added she, "has made this discovery to me, told me the place where they are to be found, and the way thither. Perhaps you may imagine these things of little consequence, that without these additions our house will always be thought sufficiently elegant, and that we can do without them. You may think as you please, but I cannot help telling you that I am persuaded that they are absolutely necessary, and I shall not be easy without them. Therefore, whether you value them or not, I desire you to consider what person you may think proper for me to send in search of the curiosities I have mentioned." "Sister," replied Prince Bahman, "nothing can concern you in which we have not an equal interest. It is enough that you desire these things to oblige us to take the same interest. But if you had not, we feel ourselves inclined of our own accord, and for our own individual satisfaction. I am persuaded my brother is of the same opinion, and therefore we ought to undertake this conquest, for the importance and singularity of the undertaking deserve that name. I will take the charge upon myself. Only tell me the place and the way to it, and I will defer my journey no longer than till tomorrow." "Brother," said Prince Perviz, "it is not proper that you, who are the head of our family, should be absent. I desire my sister should join with me to oblige you to abandon your design, and allow me to undertake it, I hope to acquit myself as well as you, and it will be a more regular proceeding." "I am persuaded of your goodwill, brother," replied Prince Bahman, "and that you would succeed as well as myself in this journey, but I have resolved and will undertake it. You shall stay at home with our sister, and I need not recommend her to you." The next morning Bahman mounted his horse, and Perviz and the princess embraced and wished him a good journey. But in the midst of their adieus, the princess recollected what she had not thought of before. "Brother," said she, "I had quite forgotten the accidents which attend travellers. Who knows whether I shall ever see you again? Alight, I beseech you, and give up this journey. I would rather be deprived of the sight and possession of the talking bird, the singing tree, and the golden water, than run the risk of never seeing you more." "Sister," replied Bahman, smiling at her sudden fears, "my resolution is fixed. The accidents you speak of befall only those who are unfortunate. But there are more who are not so. However, as events are uncertain, and I may fail in this undertaking, all I can do is to leave you this knife." Bahman, pulling a knife from his waistband and presenting it to the princess in the sheath, said, "Take this knife, sister, and give yourself the trouble sometimes to pull it out of the sheath. While you see it clean as it is now, it will be a sign that I am alive, but if you find it stained with blood, then you may believe me dead and indulge me with your prayers." The princess could obtain nothing more of Bahman. He bade adieu to her and Prince Perviz for the last time, and rode away.